In this eye-opening and unexpected journey, two married couples participate in an unconventional therapy experiment that involves swapping spouses for 6 months. The goal? To help each partner understand what they think they're missing in their marriage. But as the months unfold, love, betrayal, and self-discovery take unexpected turns. The video unravels the shocking transformations that each person undergoes, from discovering true fulfillment to finding peace and letting go. When the therapy experiment ends, the couples return to the therapists, only to reveal life-altering choices and surprise endings that no one saw coming. This story is about redefining happiness, confronting truths, and ultimately learning when it's time to move on. Welcome to Drama Horn. Anthony and Jane, a married couple themselves, had been marriage therapists for years, helping couples navigate the choppy waters of modern relationships. Their office, a quirky space filled with mismatched chairs and the scent of coffee, was a haven for couples hoping to rekindle love or, at the very least, find some peace. Today, the Karanjas, a white wealthy yet troubled couple, were their clients. Mrs. Karanja, dressed head to toe in designer labels, radiated irritation, while her husband, Mr. Karanja, wore an exhausted expression, phone in hand even as he settled into his chair. The session began with a bang. Mrs. Karanja didn't wait for introductions. "I might as well be living alone. My husband is never around," she declared, glaring at Mr. Karanja. He rolled his eyes and muttered, "Well, I wouldn't have to work so hard if you didn't treat every mall in the city like it's your private playground." Anthony tried not to laugh, sensing the tension bubbling under the surface. Jane leaned in, her tone calm but direct. "All right, let's see if we can help both of you understand where these frustrations are coming from." After a lengthy back and forth, Anthony and Jane proposed a role-swapping experiment. For one day, Mrs. Karanja would handle budgeting and household matters, while Mr. Karanja would spend his day at home, no work allowed. Both agreed, albeit reluctantly. Jane smiled encouragingly, while Anthony added a wink. "Just one day," he said, hoping the exercise would bring them closer. Little did he know it would achieve the exact opposite. 2 days later, the Karanjas returned to the office with thunderous expressions. It was clear that the experiment had been a disaster. Mrs. Karanja looked frustrated beyond measure, and Mr. Karanja seemed to have aged overnight. Anthony and Jane exchanged a worried look. Clearly, their plan had backfired. Mrs. Karanja was the first to speak, her voice high with exasperation. "I tried to budget, and let me tell you, I've never felt so suffocated in my life. Balancing bills, saving money, and looking at expenses, it's impossible." She shot a glare at Mr. Karanja. "How does anyone live like this?" Mr. Karanja, equally frustrated, shot back, "Maybe now you understand why I'm at work all the time. I tried staying home, but it was awful. The house felt empty, and all I could think about was the pile of work waiting for me. I couldn't even relax." Anthony raised his hand to interrupt the shouting. "All right, clearly, switching roles didn't help you understand each other. Let's try a different approach," he said, sharing a glance with Jane, who nodded. "Here's what we'll do, let's put a pause on these experiments. Take a breather, and in 2 weeks, let's meet again. In the meantime, reflect on why you feel the way you do. This break might give both of you a clearer perspective." The Karanjas, though still visibly irritated, reluctantly agreed. Jane reassured them, "This time, we'll try to get to the bottom of things without any role swapping. We'll focus on understanding each other's point of view." Anthony added with a grin, "And don't worry, no budgeting or forced downtime this time." With a sigh of relief, the Karanjas left, and Anthony and Jane prepared to dig deeper into their underlying issues. The 2 weeks felt longer than usual for both Anthony and Jane. They hoped the break would give the Karanjas time to reflect and approach the next session with less resentment. When the Karanjas arrived, they looked slightly less combative, though tension still hung in the air. Anthony and Jane were ready with a new approach, one focused on understanding rather than drastic experiments. Jane began, "Thank you both for giving this another shot. We're going to focus today on how you can better communicate, not just about finances or time, but about your actual needs. Anthony added, sometimes it's not just the actions themselves, but the why behind them. Let's start with a simple exercise. Each of you will tell us, in one sentence, what you truly want from this marriage. Mrs. Karanjah looked thoughtful before speaking. I just want to feel like I matter to him more than his work, she said softly, glancing over at her husband, who looked slightly taken aback. Mr. Karanjah paused before replying, and I want to feel like I'm valued for more than what I provide financially. Both seemed surprised by the simplicity and weight of their words. Anthony smiled. See? That wasn't so hard, was it? Jane nodded, adding, this is what we'll build on moving forward. Next session, let's work on finding ways you can both feel valued and understood without relying on drastic measures. As the Karanjahs left, there was a newfound calm between them. Anthony and Jane shared a smile, sensing that maybe, just maybe, this time they were onto something real. Anthony and Jane's counseling office was no stranger to tension, but today's clients, Mr. and Mrs. Zhao, brought a different kind of dilemma. The Zhaos were a middle-class couple with all the outward signs of happiness, polite smiles, gentle hand-holding, and the occasional loving glance. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Mrs. Zhao, an ambitious woman with a taste for finer things, looked at her husband with a barely concealed frustration. Mr. Zhao, calm and content, sat confidently, seemingly oblivious to his wife's complaints. As they began the session, Mrs. Zhao cut straight to the point. I love him, truly, she started, but I feel like he's not living up to his potential. He has an MBA, yet he's earning like he barely graduated high school. I know we have enough to get by, but I need more security, more ambition from him. She looked at her husband, expecting him to be moved, but Mr. Zhao merely smiled and shrugged. We live comfortably, he said, we have everything we need. I don't see why I should change jobs, just to meet some imaginary standard. My work makes me happy, and I'm good at it. Anthony and Jane exchanged a glance. The issue wasn't merely about money, it was about respect, ambition, and, ultimately, different visions of what their life together should be. To shake things up, Anthony suggested an experiment. How about we try this, he began. For 1 week, Mrs. Zhao, you'll work within Mr. Zhao's current budget to see what you can do. And Mr. Zhao, you'll actively look at higher-paying job openings, just to explore what's out there. Though reluctant, the Zhaos agreed to the challenge, each privately convinced they would prove their point. Little did they know, however, that their experiment was on a crash course toward failure. 1 week later, the Zhaos returned to Anthony and Jane's office, visibly frustrated. Mrs. Zhao had tried her best to manage within their current budget, but it left her feeling restricted, and more than ever, convinced that they could, and should, have more. Mr. Zhao, on the other hand, had spent hours scrolling through job postings, each position boasting demanding schedules and travel requirements. He had grown increasingly irritated, seeing little that aligned with his values or family time. Anthony welcomed them back, and before he could even ask how things had gone, Mrs. Zhao blurted out, "It was awful. I felt like I was squeezing every shilling to make ends meet, and it just proved my point, we need more." Mr. Zhao shook his head, clearly agitated. "And I'll tell you what I learned, every job she suggested is either draining, impersonal, or would have me working overtime and weekends. I don't want to trade my life away, just to prove my worth. We're comfortable, why is that not enough?" Jane raised a hand, urging them to pause. "It sounds like this week only deepened your frustrations rather than creating understanding." Anthony nodded, his tone calm yet firm. "Perhaps the issue isn't money or ambition, but different expectations. Mrs. Zhao, you want to see that your husband values advancement, and Mr. Zhao, you want your wife to understand the importance of a fulfilling life over mere earnings." Mrs. Zhao's shoulders slumped as she absorbed Anthony's words, while Mr. Zhao stared off, wrestling with his own thoughts. Finally, Jane suggested, take 2 weeks to really think about what you each need, not what society or anyone else tells you to need, but what matters to you. When you come back, we'll discuss how to bridge this gap. The Zhaos, still frustrated but now visibly thoughtful, agreed. They left the session with a quiet determination, both wondering if they could truly see things from each other's perspective. The next 2 weeks were a roller coaster for the Njaws. Mrs. Zhao spent time reflecting on her ambitions, asking herself why more money was so important to her. She realized that it wasn't merely about luxury, it was about feeling secure, about having something to show for their years of effort. Meanwhile, Mr. Zhao found himself reconsidering his contentment. Maybe he had been complacent, settling for a routine when he could aim higher, if only to see his wife feel more at peace. When they returned for their session, Anthony and Jane could sense a change. There was still tension, but also a willingness to listen. Jane began, "All right, how did the 2 weeks go? Did you gain any new insights?" Mrs. Zhao nodded. "I realized that my expectations may have been influenced by what I see around me. But I still want to know that he's trying, that we're both working to make things better." Mr. Zhao nodded, sighing. "I'm willing to look at other roles, but I'm not willing to take something that will sacrifice all our time together. Maybe I could consider consulting work or look into side projects that pay well without requiring me to give up what I love about my job." Anthony smiled, sensing a breakthrough. "There you go, a compromise that respects both of your needs. It's not about forcing a change, it's about finding a middle ground that allows you both to feel secure and respected." Jane added, "This won't happen overnight, but these insights are a great start. Let's work together to keep this momentum going." As they left, the Njaws seemed lighter, each recognizing that change didn't have to mean sacrifice, but rather a path to a balanced, shared life. Anthony and Jane exchanged a satisfied look, grateful to see yet another couple finding new ways to connect. In the quiet lull between sessions, Anthony and Jane sat together, sipping coffee and reflecting on the two couples they'd seen. The Karanjas were fresh in Anthony's mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more complex at play than just money and time. "I think Mrs. Karanja's loneliness is the real issue," he said, tapping his coffee mug thoughtfully. "Her husband's long hours are driving her to seek attention elsewhere, hence the shopping and constant need for distractions." Jane arched an eyebrow, considering this. "Maybe," she replied, "but Mr. Karanja's work obsession isn't helping either. He's practically married to his job. She wouldn't feel the need to fill her days with expensive outings if she felt cherished and valued by him. He's using his work as an escape from his own insecurities." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "You have to admit that he's equally at fault here." Anthony shook his head, unconvinced. "I'm not sure I buy that. What if Mrs. Karanja is just unwilling to acknowledge the limitations of their relationship? She has everything, wealth, comfort, stability, but it's like it's never enough for her. No matter how hard he works, she wants more." Jane narrowed her eyes, sensing the hint of accusation in his tone. "So, you think she's the problem?" Anthony shrugged, trying not to appear too dismissive, but Jane was already scowling. "It's not always the woman's fault just because she's unhappy, Anthony." The tension between them began to build, each defending their position with more vigor. While Anthony believed Mr. Karanja's job was a necessary sacrifice, Jane was adamant that Mr. Karanja should make more effort to balance work and family life. The disagreement only seemed to make each more convinced of their own perspective. After a pause, Jane shifted the discussion to the Njaws, still visibly frustrated by their earlier clash. "And then there's Mrs. Zhao, who can't see beyond her fixation on money," Jane said, sighing. "Mr. Zhao is perfectly content with their life, but she's ready to disrupt everything just because she wants a higher standard. Why can't she appreciate her husband's love and devotion? He's satisfied, and yet that's somehow not enough." Anthony leaned back, smirking. "Oh, so now you agree with me about one wife being the problem, huh?" Jane shot him a glare but continued. "I'm not saying she's the only problem. But you have to admit, Mr. Zhao is grounded. He knows his priorities, and he's content with a stable, if modest, lifestyle. Mrs. Zhao just keeps pressuring him, and it's pushing him away." Anthony leaned forward, clearly invested. "Jane, Mrs. Zhao has valid points too. Mr. Zhao has an MBA, but he's content with a job that barely utilizes his skills. Why shouldn't she want a better life for them both? Jane was growing frustrated, shaking her head. It's not about income level, it's about satisfaction in the marriage. Maybe he doesn't want to sell his happiness for a higher paycheck. And what's more, her constant demand for more money is eroding the love between them. The debate grew fiercer as they each dug in their heels. Anthony argued that Mrs. Zhao's push for a better lifestyle showed her commitment to their future, while Jane countered that it revealed her lack of appreciation for what they already had. Finally, exhausted, they both fell silent, staring at each other across the coffee table. So, we both agree, Anthony said finally, with a hint of a smile, that the women are the driving forces here. Whether it's loneliness or ambition, both are causing these rifts. Jane hesitated but then nodded reluctantly. Yes, but don't think this lets the husbands off the hook. They both need to see their wives' perspectives, or neither marriage is going to make it. Despite their differences, they shared a rare moment of agreement, each realizing that these issues were tangled and complex. Their conversation left them both feeling tested, yet somehow closer, united in their commitment to help these couples find a way forward. Anthony's wild proposal was met with utter shock in the Karanjas session. Sitting across from them, Anthony casually introduced the idea. What if, just as an experiment, we arranged for you both to experience life with a partner whose values align more with your desires? 6 months only, purely observational. You'd swap partners with another couple to gain perspective. Mr. Karanja's eyes widened as he sputtered, "You want us to swap spouses? Is this some kind of joke?" Mrs. Karanja, however, leaned forward, intrigued despite herself. "It would be interesting to see what it's like to live with someone who's actually present," she murmured, casting a pointed glance at her husband. Jane tried to ease the tension, saying, "This isn't about breaking any bonds, it's an experiment in empathy and understanding. Mrs. Karanja, you'd live with a man who prioritizes home life, and Mr. Karanja, you'd experience what it's like to be with someone who expects ambition and growth." Mr. Karanja scoffed, crossing his arms. "I'm ambitious, because it's necessary. Someone has to fund this luxury lifestyle she insists on." But Mrs. Karanja shot back, "Maybe if you weren't so absorbed in your work, we'd understand each other better." The session quickly escalated into accusations and defensive remarks, with Anthony and Jane working to redirect the conversation back to the benefits of the swap. After a heated debate, Jane posed a question that stilled the room. "Don't you want to know if you've truly tried everything to make this work?" She looked at each of them intently. This is one way to truly understand each other's experiences. Finally, though reluctantly, Mrs. Karanja agreed, her tone sharp as she said, "Fine. Let's see what life's like without someone constantly tied to his work." She turned to her husband, who threw his hands up. "If this will prove my point, I'll do it," he muttered. They signed the agreement, each convinced they'd be proven right, but neither realizing how profoundly the swap would impact them. When Jane and Anthony presented the experimental idea to the Zhaos, the reaction was instant disbelief. Mr. Zhao chuckled, certain it was a joke, but his laughter quickly died when he realized they were serious. "You want us to swap spouses? For 6 months?" he asked incredulously. Mrs. Zhao, however, looked at Jane with a flicker of interest. "So, I would be paired with someone who has a high-paying job, who works as hard as I want my husband to." She turned to her husband, eyes gleaming. "It's not that crazy, Daniel. It would be a real-life test drive of what we both keep asking each other to be." Mr. Zhao frowned, hurt flashing across his face. "You want to test drive another man? I thought we were here to improve our relationship, not jump into some bizarre experiment." Anthony interjected calmly, "This isn't about replacing anyone, Mr. Zhao. This is a chance to understand what your partner values by living in their reality. Mrs. Zhao would experience the high-income lifestyle she desires, while you'd experience a partnership that doesn't put financial pressure first." But Mr. Zhao shook his head, skeptical. "Money doesn't buy happiness. It's not about income, it's about love and stability." The room fell silent for a moment before Mrs. Zhao spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Daniel, Don't you think that if we truly understood each other's desires, we'd have more peace? Her words seemed to sway him, and after several more rounds of back and forth, both women signed the agreement with an air of satisfaction, their husbands reluctantly following suit. With that, the swap was set in motion, each spouse convinced they would prove their point, unaware that the experiment would push them far beyond their comfort zones and into life-altering realizations. The Karanjas and the Njas left the session with mixed emotions, anxiety, resentment, but also a hint of excitement. As Anthony and Jane packed up for the day, they felt the weight of what had just happened. "We just signed them up for 6 months that could make or break their marriages," Jane murmured, half in disbelief. Anthony nodded. "But sometimes, drastic times call for drastic measures." They were on the verge of giving up anyway. Maybe this swap will show them what they truly want. Still, they both knew they were treading on uncharted ground. As the couple settled into their new routines, unexpected challenges began to surface. Mrs. Karanja found herself feeling deeply conflicted when she witnessed the unhurried, loving manner in which Mr. Njau approached life, focusing on small joys and family connection. It felt unfamiliar, even unsettling, to be with someone who didn't constantly chase after something more. Meanwhile, Mr. Karanja discovered that his new partner's ambitious expectations left him feeling pressured and defensive, opening his eyes to the toll his workaholic habits might be taking on his own marriage. Mrs. Njau, conversely, found herself shocked by the loneliness that came with her new partner's high-powered job, discovering that the lifestyle she thought she craved was filled with late nights and absence. Weeks turned into months, and each partner began to see their marriage in a different light, gaining insights that went far beyond surface complaints. They had entered the swap expecting to find validation of their grievances, yet they were beginning to understand the reality behind their partner's choices and sacrifices. By the end of 6 months, each couple was on the brink of transformation, having embarked on a journey they never anticipated but could never forget. When Mrs. Njau first stepped into Mr. Karanja's grand mansion, she was speechless. The high ceilings, sparkling chandeliers, and gleaming marble floors were like something out of a dream. She had seen luxury homes in magazines, but to actually live in one was beyond her imagination. Mr. Karanja, though generally reserved, couldn't help but notice her expression of pure awe. He also couldn't ignore her own elegance. She was graceful and attentive, with a keen sense of beauty in the way she dressed and carried herself. Unlike his own wife, Mrs. Njau didn't come across as demanding, rather, she seemed genuinely appreciative of the comforts around her. This intrigued him, especially as he noticed how easily she fit into his world, showing a respectfulness that quietly won him over. As the days passed, Mr. Karanja began to notice little things that set Mrs. Njau apart from his wife. She respected his work routine without complaints, even staying up late each evening just to greet him when he returned. He'd come home to find her in the kitchen, carefully preparing a hot meal and waiting with a warm smile, a comforting gesture he'd never experienced before. There was a peacefulness to the way she interacted with him. Instead of questioning his late hours or demanding more of his time, she seemed content to share whatever moments he could spare. This quiet support felt refreshingly new to him, and it softened him in a way he hadn't anticipated. Soon, he realized he was rushing through work just a bit more, eager to get back home to that quiet, welcoming warmth. Over the following weeks, Mr. Karanja found himself looking forward to coming home, a shift that surprised even him. The chaos and pressures of his job were still there, but knowing someone was waiting for him at the end of the day made it all feel more manageable. Mrs. Njau's attentive nature extended beyond simply preparing meals. She kept the house organized, made thoughtful gestures, and even encouraged him to relax and share stories about his day. He found himself laughing more, easing into a routine that felt more like a partnership than anything he'd ever had. For the first time, he didn't feel like a visitor in his own home. It was a change he never expected, but one he realized he wanted more of. One evening, as rain pattered softly against the windows, Mr. Karanja and Mrs. Njau found themselves in the cozy warmth of the living room. A gentle fire crackled in the fireplace, casting a soft glow over the room, while a bottle of fine red wine sat open on the table. Mrs. Njau poured them each a glass, and they leaned back into the plush leather sofas, each feeling more at ease than they'd ever expected. Their conversation drifted from light-hearted topics to more personal stories, and soon they found themselves sharing the paths that had led them to this very moment. For Mr. Karanja, his journey had been one of both privilege and responsibility. He spoke of how he'd met his wife, young and full of dreams in college, where life seemed full of endless possibilities. Back then, he was the carefree son of a wealthy businessman, his future nearly mapped out for him. Mr. Karanja's tone softened as he recounted the shock of losing his father, an event that forced him to grow up overnight. Suddenly, I was in charge of a struggling business and everyone's livelihoods rested on my shoulders, he said, swirling his wine thoughtfully. The carefree life I had imagined disappeared, replaced by long hours and endless responsibilities. My wife tried to support me at first, but it became clear that she had different expectations. He looked over at Mrs. Zhao, who listened intently, her eyes warm with understanding. It's admirable, she said gently, you took on such a heavy burden and turned it into success. Few people would have managed that. Her words seemed to touch something in him, and he found himself appreciating her empathy, her genuine interest in his story. In turn, Mrs. Zhao shared her own story, which was marked by rebellion and courage. Growing up in a strict home, she had been expected to marry well and conform to her father's plans. My father wanted me to marry the chief as his second wife, she said with a laugh, though her eyes held a hint of sadness. But I couldn't imagine a life confined like that. When I met Zhao, he had a quiet strength, a determination to make something of himself in Nairobi. I was captivated. So, one night, I packed a small bag, left a note, and ran off with him. We started with nothing, but those were some of the happiest days of my life. Mr. Karanja looked at her with newfound admiration, marveling at the courage it must have taken to leave her entire world behind. As the evening wore on, they shared stories of their youth, laughter spilling into the quiet room as they reminisced. The warmth of the fireplace, the glow of the wine, and the easy conversation wrapped around them like a comfortable blanket. Each of them felt a connection they hadn't anticipated, a meeting of minds and hearts that was new and refreshing. They toasted to the memories, each glance lingering a bit longer, each laugh carrying an ease that was hard to come by in their usual lives. In those moments, Mr. Karanja realized that he was feeling something he hadn't felt in years, true companionship, the kind that didn't demand anything in return but gave so much warmth in exchange. When Mrs. Karanja first stepped into Mr. Zhao's cozy three-bedroom bungalow, she felt a strange mix of curiosity and surprise. Used to grand mansions and polished marble floors, the bungalow felt modest but exceptionally welcoming. Everything was in perfect order, from the neatly arranged shoes at the door to the sparkling clean floors that gleamed under the light. She couldn't help but admire the warmth and homeliness that filled each corner of the house. There was something soothing in its simplicity, a stark contrast to her own home's grandeur, which often felt cold and formal. Mr. Zhao's shy but genuine smile only added to the comforting atmosphere. Though she noticed he looked a bit nervous around her designer outfit and elegance, his polite hospitality and warm demeanor put her at ease. It was a different world, but one she was quickly finding enjoyable. The biggest surprise, however, came at dinner. Mr. Zhao prepared a meal that left her speechless. Used to having a personal chef, Mrs. Karanja had never seen her own husband cook, let alone serve her a meal made with such care. The aroma of freshly prepared food filled the house, and when she took her first bite, she couldn't hide her amazement. "You can cook this well?" she asked, genuinely surprised. He laughed, explaining that he had always believed in taking care of his family in every way he could, including cooking. Embarrassed, she admitted she didn't know her way around a kitchen, which only seemed to amuse him. "Maybe I can teach you," he suggested with a warm smile, and to her own surprise, she found herself agreeing eagerly. It was a refreshing change, and something about the simplicity of it made her feel more grounded. As days passed, Mrs. Karanja found herself enjoying her time with Mr. Zhao more than she anticipated. She started looking forward to their evening cooking sessions, which had become a routine. Mr. Zhao was patient, guiding her with humor and encouragement as she attempted to chop vegetables or stir sauces. Every meal they prepared together was a small accomplishment, and each one filled her with a quiet satisfaction she hadn't known before. She admired his calm nature, his simple but thoughtful gestures, and the way he seemed genuinely interested in her day, without any hidden agenda. It wasn't just the food or the modest surroundings, it was the way he treated her, with respect and warmth, that felt deeply comforting. He wasn't trying to impress her with wealth or status, just sincerity, and that was something she hadn't realized she missed so much. Over time, she noticed herself changing in small but significant ways. She began helping with tidying up the house, appreciating the sense of accomplishment it brought. They'd sit on the small but cozy sofa after dinner, sharing stories and laughing about life's small moments. His kindness and humility showed her a different side of life, one that didn't revolve around social status or material possessions. She felt truly seen and appreciated, not for her looks or the luxury she usually surrounded herself with, but for simply being herself. It was a gentle, unexpected happiness that crept up on her without warning, and she started realizing that there was so much more to life than the high society lifestyle she was accustomed to. The Karanjas are a unique couple, blending their British ancestry with a deep-rooted Kenyan identity. Both born and raised in Kenya, Steve Karanja Miller and his wife, Angela Karanja, are in their late 40s. Steve, originally named Stephen Miller, is the son of British settlers who had established themselves in Kenya during the colonial era. His father managed a coffee estate and, as a young boy, Steve spent his days roaming the farm, learning not only the business but also the Kikuyu language and culture from the local workers. His godfather, a Kikuyu elder named Mzee Karanja, was his father's trusted right-hand man and became a father figure to young Steve. Out of respect and a deep bond with Mzee Karanja, Steve took on the Kikuyu surname and became known as Steve Karanja Miller, a name that reflects his mixed heritage and connection to the land and its people. Now a successful businessman himself, Steve is the CEO of a large agricultural company he inherited and expanded after his father passed away, a responsibility that consumes much of his life. Angela Karanja, on the other hand, is a woman of poise and elegance, with her own complex ties to Kenyan society. Born in Nairobi, Angela attended international schools and later studied art in Europe, which gave her a taste for the finer things in life. Now 45, Angela is deeply involved in Nairobi's social circles, spending much of her time attending charity events, galas, and art exhibitions. Though she loves Kenya, she often feels caught between worlds, yearning for her husband's presence yet feeling misunderstood in her desire for a more glamorous lifestyle. This tension has built over the years, as she feels increasingly isolated in their grand but often empty home, struggling to find fulfillment in the quiet life her husband's work demands. Though Steve's Kikuyu identity adds depth to their connection to Kenya, Angela sometimes feels out of place, wishing for a life that isn't centered on business but on shared experiences and mutual attention. The Njas, by contrast, are a grounded, middle-class Kikuyu couple in their early 30s who embrace the simplicity of their lives. Daniel Njau, 34, works as an accountant in Nairobi, a job he enjoys for its stability and close proximity to his family. Raised in a small town in the lush highlands of Mount Kenya, Daniel has always valued hard work, family, and community over material wealth. He is a calm, introspective man who finds joy in the little things, spending time with his wife, cooking, and maintaining his modest bungalow, which is a world away from the Karanja's mansion. Though he doesn't earn a high salary, Daniel is proud of the life he's built, and he feels it's enough as long as he and his wife are happy. He has an easygoing charm and a quiet confidence, though he can sometimes come across as stubborn when it comes to his belief that wealth is secondary to love and family. Grace Njau, 31, is equally hardworking and spirited. Raised in a traditional Kikuyu household, she developed a strong sense of independence and ambition, traits that led her to elope with Daniel against her family's wishes. While she loves her husband dearly, Grace often wishes for a better lifestyle that reflects Daniel's potential, believing that his MBA degree should be opening doors to a higher income. She sometimes feels torn between her contented life with Daniel and a longing for a more comfortable, affluent life. Her aspirations for success and comfort mirror Angela's in a different way, and she's intrigued by the Karanja's lifestyle, wondering what it might be like to live with someone who prioritizes career advancement. In many ways, the Njas reflect a modern Kenyan story, a young couple rooted in tradition yet navigating new ideals of ambition and success. The contrast between the Karanjas and the Njas highlights not only their cultural differences but also their distinct values, creating an intriguing dynamic in their lives. Mr. Njao's heart for giving back to his community has been a driving force in his life, especially through his monthly trips to his home village to support those in need. Over the years, he has built a small network of friends and colleagues who support his initiatives by donating money, food, and clothing for needy children in the village. This weekend, he has organized a visit to a children's home that he's particularly passionate about. Some of his friends from a local WhatsApp group have donated funds for food and clothing, while others have offered children's clothes that he plans to deliver personally. But what excites him even more is his long-term plan to build a library for the children, a dream he's been nurturing quietly. He believes a library would inspire these children to love reading and help them explore a world of possibilities beyond the village. Mr. Njao has been diligently raising funds for this project, which will cost about 600,000 Kenyan shillings to cover the building structure, washrooms, an office, solar power, and, of course, a variety of books. When Mrs. Karanja hears about Mr. Njao's project, she feels a surprising surge of excitement. Although her life is far removed from such grassroots work, she has always had a soft spot for charity and volunteering, often attending high-profile fundraising galas and contributing to urban charities. The idea of directly impacting a rural children's home feels fresh and thrilling to her. The simplicity and purpose behind Mr. Njao's vision touch her deeply, as she's never considered the possibility of actually helping to build something from the ground up. She imagines how rewarding it must feel to see the children benefit from a place built with love and community support. Inspired, she asks Mr. Njao about the cost involved, genuinely interested in understanding what it would take to make this library a reality. She's surprised to learn that the full amount is only 600,000 Kenyan shillings, a modest sum compared to the kind of donations she's seen in her circles. The more they discuss it, the more energized both Mr. Njao and Mrs. Karanja become. She's impressed by his dedication and how meticulously he's planned every detail, from the solar power that will keep the library lit to the washrooms that ensure the children's comfort. For her, this project is a chance to do something real, away from the polished events and photo ops she's used to. Mr. Njao's passion is contagious, and as they talk, she starts envisioning herself contributing to the effort, even considering making a significant donation herself. The library project becomes a shared excitement, and they spend the evening brainstorming ways to bring in additional resources, with Mrs. Karanja promising to connect him to people who might be willing to help. By the end of the conversation, they both feel a renewed sense of purpose, bonded by a project that represents not only a gift to the children but also a meaningful way to connect with their communities and each other. As Mrs. Karanja lay in bed that night, a newfound sense of purpose filled her mind, making it difficult to sleep. Her conversation with Mr. Njao had planted a seed, prompting her to question the life she'd been leading and what she truly valued. She'd always associated joy with luxury, the comfort of her designer clothes, the elegance of her grand home, and the status that came with her social circle. Yet, for all the material pleasures she surrounded herself with, she couldn't recall the last time she'd felt the simple, profound happiness she'd seen in Mr. Njao's eyes when he spoke of helping the village children. There, lying alone in a modest room, she realized she was yearning for something more meaningful than any of her expensive possessions had ever given her. She decided that in the morning, she would return home and gather her designer clothes, jewelry, and accessories to sell, determined to contribute significantly to the library project. It was a symbolic step, but one that felt incredibly freeing, a chance to redefine herself and create real change. Meanwhile, in the grand mansion's dimly lit living room, Mr. Karanja and Mrs. Njao were finishing the last sips of their third bottle of wine. The warmth of the fire and the effects of the wine had relaxed them both, leading them into an unexpected comfort with one another. Throughout the evening, they'd shared more than just stories, they'd connected on a level neither of them had felt in years, one where they felt truly seen and valued. Mrs. Zhao's genuine warmth and humble appreciation for life had captivated Mr. Karanjah, and in her presence, he found a simplicity that was both refreshing and alluring. Mrs. Zhao, too, was drawn to Mr. Karanjah's strength and the quiet vulnerability he seldom displayed to the outside world. Their shared laughter and honest exchanges had created a bond that felt as inevitable as it was unexpected. As they stood by the stairs, each about to head to their separate rooms, an unspoken tension hung in the air. When their eyes met, it was as if all barriers fell away. Without a word, they both leaned into an embrace, a magnetic pull that neither could resist. The kiss that followed was intense, fueled by a mutual yearning that had been growing beneath the surface. In that moment, their responsibilities, their spouses, and the consequences faded away. They made their way into Mr. Karanjah's room, and for the first time in a long while, both felt wholly alive, wrapped in a mix of desire, comfort, and understanding that neither had anticipated. The night unfolded between them in a whirlwind of passion, a fleeting escape from the complexities of their everyday lives that they both seemed powerless to resist. When Mrs. Karanjah returned early the next morning, her heart was brimming with excitement and newfound purpose. Her mind raced with plans for the library project, and she couldn't wait to share them with her husband. She envisioned explaining how she wanted to contribute by selling her designer clothes and accessories to make a meaningful difference for the children in the village. In her eagerness, she barely noticed her husband's car still parked in the garage. Determined to surprise him with her new outlook on life, she hurried upstairs to their master bedroom, expecting to find him perhaps surprised at her sudden early return. She'd imagined waking him up gently, telling him about her decision, and sharing a hopeful moment together, imagining how they could work towards something greater as a couple. However, as Mrs. Karanjah opened the door, the sight before her was nothing she could have prepared for. Her husband, Mr. Karanjah, was in an intimate embrace with Mrs. Zhao, lost in each other, their movements passionate and raw. They were oblivious to her entrance, entirely wrapped up in one another, their faces reflecting a depth of desire and release she hadn't seen in years. A flood of emotions hit her at once. Shock immobilized her, but beneath it, she felt a strange mix of betrayal, confusion, and even an odd fascination. Here was her husband, who had been so distant for so long, suddenly alive and vulnerable in a way she hadn't witnessed before. The intensity of their passion startled her, making her realize just how much had been missing in her own marriage. Standing there unnoticed, she was forced to confront the depth of their detachment from each other, a distance she'd perhaps overlooked or grown accustomed to. Mr. Karanjah and Mrs. Zhao were lost in their own world, caught up in the thrill of their shared connection, a bond that had grown from mutual understanding and unspoken loneliness. For Mr. Karanjah, Mrs. Zhao offered a gentleness and warmth he had craved, a reminder of simpler, more honest emotions. She seemed to accept him without expectations, grounding him in ways his complex life often left unfulfilled. As they moved together, it was as though they were chasing an escape from all the societal pressures, responsibilities, and unspoken grievances. In that private world, they found a comfort neither had been able to express in their marriages. Mrs. Zhao, in turn, felt desired, appreciated for who she was without judgment or demands for change. In Mr. Karanjah, she found a protector, someone who valued her, and their connection brought to life desires and needs she'd buried long ago. For Mrs. Karanjah, standing there witnessing this private betrayal, her initial shock slowly transformed into something deeper, a profound realization of the emptiness she, too, had been feeling. She could feel her heart race, her breath shallow, but instead of a simple anger, she felt a raw ache of understanding. Her husband, whom she'd perceived as distant and indifferent, was capable of such depth and tenderness, it was just no longer for her. Her dreams of rekindling their bond through charity work now seemed naive, a fragile illusion shattered in that single moment. Silently, she backed out of the room, closing the door quietly behind her, the weight of the betrayal pressing heavily upon her. She left without a word, carrying a sense of loss, but also a strange clarity, as though she had finally seen the truth hidden beneath the layers of their marriage. At the moment Mrs. Karanjah reached the main door, she felt a surge of purpose override her anger and heartbreak. Her mission to contribute meaningfully to the children's library project was more significant than her husband's betrayal. Without allowing herself to wallow in sadness, she resolved to follow through with her plan, knowing her life needed a drastic change. Steeling herself, she turned around and headed back upstairs, this time with a new sense of resolve. Entering the bedroom once more, she moved quietly but purposefully past her husband and Mrs. Zhao, who were still lost in each other's arms, unaware of her presence. Mrs. Karanja strode over to her closet, beginning to pull out her designer clothes noisily enough to disrupt their world. The sound jolted Mr. Karanja and Mrs. Zhao from their embrace, and they froze, horror spreading across their faces as they processed her presence in the room. As she pulled out 4 large suitcases, rolling them into the bedroom with a fierce determination, Mr. Karanja and Mrs. Zhao sat in stunned silence, unable to muster a single word. Their expressions were a mix of shock, guilt, and a rising dread, like 2 children caught in a forbidden act. Mrs. Karanja met their eyes briefly, a look of steely resolve and deep betrayal flashing across her face as she began packing. Each item she folded and placed into the suitcase seemed to be a quiet, condemning statement. Her silence was more powerful than any outburst, and it left both her husband and Mrs. Zhao paralyzed, watching helplessly as she gathered her belongings. Mr. Karanja tried to speak, opening his mouth several times, but no words came. His face was ashen, and he looked almost afraid, his usually confident demeanor replaced with sheer helplessness. When Mrs. Karanja was done packing, she stood in the middle of the room, her gaze unwavering as she turned to face the 2. Without a single word to them, she walked to the intercom and summoned the house staff to come upstairs. Mr. Karanja's face turned even paler as he realized what she was doing. Bringing the staff in was not only practical. She needed help with the bags, but it was also symbolic. She wanted witnesses to her husband's betrayal, ensuring that his infidelity would not be hidden behind closed doors. The staff arrived and, one by one, took in the scene, their eyes widening as they understood what had transpired. Mrs. Karanja watched silently as each suitcase was taken downstairs and loaded into her car. Her husband and Mrs. Zhao remained frozen, mortified and speechless, shrinking under the gaze of the staff. When the last bag was loaded, Mrs. Karanja cast one final, hard look at her husband, making it clear without words that this was an end to something. Then, without a backward glance, she left the room and drove off, leaving the 2 behind in a silence that echoed with the weight of what they had lost. As Mrs. Karanja walked into the high-end resale shop, she felt an unusual blend of excitement and finality. The shop was a well-known establishment, popular with the upper class for buying exclusive, designer items from those looking to make discreet but substantial sales. It was a place she'd once frequented as a buyer, acquiring luxurious items that had defined her lifestyle. But now, standing here as a seller, her mindset was completely different. Each item she took out of the suitcases felt like she was shedding an old part of herself, letting go of the superficial comforts that had once seemed so essential. When the shop's evaluator handed her a total of 280,000 Kenyan shillings, a sense of satisfaction settled over her. She wasn't attached to the money as she might have been before. Instead, she felt proud knowing this amount would directly contribute to building something lasting and meaningful. In her heart, this decision was no longer just about charity, it was her fresh start, a reclamation of her purpose. From the resale shop, she drove to a car dealership owned by an old friend who greeted her with his usual warmth and curiosity, surprised to see her arriving alone and without her usual entourage. When she explained her desire to trade in her luxurious Range Rover for a simpler car and cash, he was taken aback, questioning if she was sure about the decision. But Mrs. Karanja was resolute, insisting on trading the latest Range Rover for a modest Honda. The deal was finalized quickly, and as she watched her sleek black Range Rover disappear from sight, she felt a surprising lightness wash over her. The bank transfer for 12 million Kenyan shillings hit her account shortly after, a tangible reminder of the transformation she was committed to making. She knew the funds could complete the library project, and for the first time in years, she felt that her wealth had a real purpose. Driving away in the Honda, Mrs. Karanja felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment and clarity. She had always measured her worth by the luxury surrounding her, but now, as she envisioned the library taking shape in her mind, she realized this project was the most valuable thing she had ever invested in. It wasn't just the money she was donating, she was putting a part of herself into something that would benefit others in a profound way. The simplicity of the Honda, the absence of designer labels, and the lightness in her heart combined to create a sense of freedom she hadn't felt in years. Her journey that day had shifted something deep within her, and she was ready to build a life driven by purpose rather than appearances. As she drove back to the city, she couldn't wait to inform Mr. Zhao and see the dream of the children's library finally take shape, knowing she had reclaimed her life by making a real difference. When Mrs. Karanja arrived at Mr. Zhao's modest home that evening, she felt an unexpected surge of calm and satisfaction. She headed straight to the kitchen, carefully preparing his favorite meal, a simple, hearty stew that she had learned to make over the past months. It was a dish she had come to enjoy cooking, a comforting contrast to the gourmet meals she was accustomed to. As she stirred the pot, her mind wandered back to her earlier, painful discovery of her husband's affair with Mrs. Zhao. Her marriage, which had once been her anchor, now felt like a distant memory, something fragile that had shattered silently over time. Though the betrayal stung, she was ready to face the end of that chapter with resolve. Now, with a clear mind, she was focused on something much more meaningful, bringing to life a project that would impact countless children. The funds she had raised were more than just money, they were a new purpose, and for the first time, she felt that her life was moving in a direction she could be proud of. When Mr. Zhao returned home that evening, he was met with the delicious aroma of his favorite meal filling the house, and the sight of Mrs. Karanja waiting for him with a warm smile. He was visibly delighted, genuinely touched by her thoughtfulness. As they sat down to eat, he couldn't help but marvel at how she had managed to capture the exact flavor he loved, and he gave her a playful thumbs up for her culinary skills. But the surprise didn't end there. As they finished their meal, Mrs. Karanja looked at him with excitement, her eyes gleaming, and told him she had managed to raise the full amount needed for the library project. She explained her recent sales and the sacrifice she had made to fund the project, her voice filled with joy and fulfillment. This was something she had longed to share, and now, seeing the impact her decision would have on the children's lives, she felt that her sacrifices were truly worth it. Mr. Zhao was stunned, both grateful and slightly hesitant. He had never imagined she would go to such lengths for his cause, especially given their differences in lifestyle and priorities. He felt deeply appreciative, yet he also felt a pang of discomfort. "It's incredible that you've raised this amount, and I can't thank you enough," he began carefully, "but are you absolutely sure you're ready to give up so much for this?" He was touched by her generosity, but he was also worried she might be acting impulsively. For him, the children's library was a dream built over years of modest contributions, and he couldn't quite grasp how someone could change their life so drastically in just a few days. Yet, Mrs. Karanja's determination softened his concerns, as she assured him that this was a decision she had made with conviction and that she found immense joy in giving back. Her unwavering commitment began to dispel his doubts, and a sense of shared purpose started to bloom between them, as both of them looked forward to making a lasting impact on the community. When Mr. Zhao and Mrs. Karanja arrived at the children's home, they were greeted by a joyful scene that warmed their hearts. Children danced in bright, colorful attire, their laughter ringing through the air like music. As they approached, the eldest child, Naomi, stepped forward to lead a heartfelt prayer, expressing gratitude for the generosity that would soon bring a new library to life in their small village. Mrs. Karanja felt a surge of emotion as she listened to Naomi's words, realizing how much this meant to these children. They were welcoming her with open arms, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Seeing the radiant smiles and hearing the children's hopeful voices filled her with a sense of joy and purpose unlike any she had ever experienced. It was as if the luxury she once cherished paled in comparison to this simple, genuine moment. As Mr. Zhao announced that the funds had been raised and construction would soon begin, the cheers from the children and villagers were overwhelming. Mrs. Karanja found herself caught up in their enthusiasm, her heart swelling with pride for having taken part in such a meaningful endeavor. She spent the day talking with the children, asking them about their dreams and what they hoped to learn in the new library. Many of them wanted to read storybooks, learn about animals, or find books that would help them with their studies. She was especially touched by their curiosity and eagerness to learn, qualities she had perhaps taken for granted in her own life. The simplicity of their desires and the purity of their excitement made her feel grounded. Here, in this village, she was witnessing a kind of happiness that wasn't based on possessions, but on shared hopes and community support. Throughout the day, Mrs. Karanja helped Mr. Zhao distribute food, clothing, and small gifts they had brought along. She found herself laughing with the children, listening intently as they shared their stories, and even joining in some of the traditional dances with the other villagers. She noticed how naturally Mr. Zhao interacted with everyone, from the children to the elderly villagers, always offering a kind word or warm smile. Watching him in his element made her feel a newfound respect for his commitment to giving back. For the first time, she felt genuinely connected to something beyond herself, and it was a refreshing change from her usual world of social gatherings and luxury events. By the end of the day, she felt not only fulfilled but deeply inspired. She knew that helping to build this library was just the beginning of her journey toward a more meaningful life, and she looked forward to seeing the project come to life in the coming weeks. When they arrived back in Nairobi late that night, Mr. Zhao and Mrs. Karanja were both exhausted yet deeply satisfied from the fulfilling day they'd spent in the village. The success of their visit, seeing the joy on the children's faces and the hope in the eyes of the villagers, lingered in their minds, casting a warm glow over everything. However, the following morning, Mr. Zhao noticed that Mrs. Karanja was unusually quiet, her expression heavy with unspoken thoughts. Concerned, he gently asked her what was bothering her, sensing that something was weighing on her heart. With a quiet sigh, she finally revealed the painful truth she'd been holding back, the sight of her husband and Mrs. Zhao in bed together. Her words hung in the air, raw and bare, and Mr. Zhao felt the truth slam into him like a physical blow. He had suspected his wife of avoiding commitment, especially on the topic of children, but he hadn't expected outright betrayal. As they discussed the shocking discovery, a knock sounded at the door. They exchanged a tense look, a strange feeling of anticipation rising between them. When Mr. Zhao opened the door, the sight before him immediately filled him with anger. Standing outside, drenched from the rain, were their spouses, looking like drenched and pitiful figures, with guilt etched on their faces. Without a word, Mr. Zhao's jaw clenched, and in a swift, fierce motion, he threw a powerful punch straight at Mr. Karanja's face, sending him sprawling into the muddy ground outside. The thud of the impact and the sight of Mr. Karanja covered in mud mirrored the resentment that had been boiling within him. He turned his glare towards Mrs. Zhao, his eyes cold and unyielding, before slamming the door in their faces, leaving them out in the rain. Without another word, he stormed back inside, a wave of emotion overtaking him as he made his way toward the bedroom he'd once shared with his wife. Driven by a determination to end things then and there, Mr. Zhao methodically began packing up his wife's belongings. He moved quickly, fueled by anger and betrayal, grabbing clothes, shoes, and every small reminder of her presence, and stuffing them into 2 large suitcases. With every item he packed, he felt a bitter satisfaction. He was erasing the traces of her deceit from his life. Meanwhile, Mrs. Karanja stood silently at the doorway, watching the scene unfold, her expression unreadable as she saw her husband and his lover pleading in the rain. When he was done packing, Mr. Zhao yanked the suitcases to the front door and threw them outside, his voice thundering, "Don't come back. This home is no longer yours." His wife's pleas for forgiveness fell on deaf ears as he dismissed her with a steely gaze, refusing to allow her any explanation. For Mr. Zhao, this was the last act of their marriage, the final severance of a bond tainted by betrayal. As the rain poured, he looked out to see both his wife and Mr. Karanja standing in the mud, soaked and humbled, their remorseful faces barely visible through the sheets of rain. But he felt nothing but a hollow sense of closure, his anger having burned itself out with each bag thrown to the ground. Beside him, Mrs. Karanja maintained a calm yet resolute stance, her silence speaking louder than words. She didn't offer her husband or Mrs. Zhao a single word, her own pain too deep to be spoken. Together, she and Mr. Zhao stood firm, watching the rain wash away any last remnants of sympathy they might have felt, knowing that after today, they would each walk a new path, finally free from the shadows of betrayal. 6 months after the initial couple swap experiment, Mr. Zhao and Mrs. Karanja returned to Jane and Anthony's office as planned, ready to discuss the outcome. The air was thick with an odd mixture of relief and anticipation as they took their seats across from the therapists. Jane and Anthony had expected all 4 participants, but it soon became apparent that Mr. Karanja and Mrs. Zhao had deliberately chosen not to attend. Their absence was almost symbolic, marking the end of old ties and hidden grievances that no longer held sway over Mr. Zhao and Mrs. Karanja's lives. As they settled in, both looked remarkably at peace, a far cry from the troubled and resentful individuals they had been at the start of the experiment. This alone left the therapists intrigued, wondering what unexpected turns had brought them to such a place of calm resolution. The discussion that followed was both surprising and revealing. Mr. Zhao explained how, over the months, he had come to realize that his simple, steady life was a source of true contentment, one that hadn't relied on the validation of an unfaithful spouse. Mrs. Karanja, on the other hand, shared her journey from a life of luxury without purpose to one of genuine fulfillment. She described her newfound joy in giving back, highlighting how the library project had changed her perspective on life and helped her redefine what success and happiness truly meant. As they spoke, the therapists listened intently, noting the drastic transformations each had undergone. Mr. Zhao and Mrs. Karanja's stories illustrated how, while the couple swap experiment had failed in bringing their marriages back together, it had nonetheless been a strange blessing in disguise. Each had learned valuable lessons about love, respect, and self-worth, ultimately leading them to leave behind relationships that no longer served them. The therapists were further shocked when they learned that Mr. Karanja had offered his wife a substantial settlement of $5 million, which Mrs. Karanja accepted without hesitation. She was ready to sever ties entirely, and the amount provided her with the freedom to continue her philanthropic work on her own terms. Mr. Zhao, on the other hand, had finalized his divorce with his ex-wife without any settlement, as Mrs. Zhao left with only her pride, unwilling to fight for anything after her own betrayal. Despite the heartbreak, Mr. Zhao wished his former spouse well, finding peace in his own life's work and purpose. In a bittersweet twist, their former spouses, Mr. Karanja and Mrs. Zhao, were now planning to marry each other, a decision that left the therapists speechless, both perplexed and fascinated by the unforeseen turn of events. In closing, Jane and Anthony sat down to compile their report, struggling to capture the moral complexities and unexpected transformations they had witnessed. While the experiment hadn't mended the couple's marriages, it had inadvertently opened the door to personal growth, self-discovery, and the pursuit of happiness free from past entanglements. The moral of their study was clear: true contentment cannot be forced within the constraints of a broken relationship. Instead, it's often found by stepping outside of one's comfort zone, learning to value oneself, and sometimes, as painful as it is, letting go of what no longer brings fulfillment. For Mr. Zhao and Mrs. Karanja, the journey toward healing had been difficult, but it had also led them to the realization that sometimes, the most loving choice is to set both yourself and the other person free. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of courage, sacrifice, and the power of true love. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more epic adventures, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Stay tuned for more stories from Drama Horn.